There are people who stand at the center of a story for years and never speak the loudest part of it out loud. Not because they are weak. Not because they have forgotten. But because some truths carry collateral damage. Children who will grow up and search their own names, a public that consumes pain the way it consumes everything else, and a silence that, once broken, cannot be rebuilt. Kelly Clarkson broke that silence. And what came out of it wasn't what anyone expected. Because the story the world thought it knew about Kelly Clarkson and Brandon Blackstock, the fairy tale courtship, the ranch in Montana, the red carpet photographs where they looked like proof that love was still possible, that story was always missing something. Something significant. Something Kelly herself spent years unable to fully name, let alone say out loud in a room full of people who were going to repeat it everywhere. What she has finally revealed changes everything about how you understand that marriage. Not just the divorce. Not just the legal battles or the custody arrangements or the property disputes that played out in courtrooms for years after the relationship had already died in private. But the thing underneath all of that. The thing she protected, and why she protected it, and what it cost her to keep it hidden for as long as she did. Stay with this. Because what Kelly said, what she finally allowed herself to say, is not what you think it is. Kelly Brianne Clarkson was 6 years old the first time someone she loved left without explanation. Her father didn't drift away. Didn't fade. He packed his things and walked out the door of a house in Burleson, Texas, and the family that had existed the day before simply ceased to exist in the same form. Her brother went to live with their father. Her sister went to an aunt. Kelly stayed with her mother. One departure, and the family scattered like something dropped on a hard floor, fragments sliding in every direction, none of them landing close enough to touch. That kind of early loss doesn't announce itself as damage. It announces itself as normal. When you are 6 years old and the architecture of your world rearranges itself overnight, you don't have the language for what happened to you. You only know that love, apparently, is the kind of thing that leaves. And that knowledge sits inside you like a stone for years before you understand what it has been doing to everything you built on top of it. It shaped every relationship Kelly ever had. It shaped the songs she wrote and the way she sang them and the specific hunger in her voice that audiences recognized without being able to explain. It shaped what she was looking for, what she was always, quietly, looking for, in every person she let herself get close to. When she stood on the American Idol stage in 2002, 19 years old, wearing clothes she'd chosen with no guidance, terrified and completely alone, the voice that came out of her wasn't just talent. It was need. It was everything that had been building since Burleson. And the world recognized it instantly, the way people always recognize something true, even when they can't explain why it's moving them. She won. And then the world got complicated. The years that followed the Idol win were not the glossy success story the public was sold. Behind the Grammy stages and the arena tours and the record deals were battles with her label, fights over creative control, a relationship with the music industry that often felt less like partnership and more like ownership. Kelly learned to fight for herself inside systems that were not designed with her interests at the center. She learned to smile for cameras while negotiating wars behind closed doors. She became very good at managing the distance between what she showed the world and what she was actually living. And in 2006, at a rehearsal for the Academy of Country Music Awards, she met Brandon Blackstock. He was Reba McEntire's stepson. He was a talent manager. He was handsome and confident in the low-key way of men who are used to moving in powerful rooms. The first meeting was brief, a handshake, a few exchanged words, the kind of encounter that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening. Kelly filed it away and moved on. But she didn't forget him. When their paths crossed again years later, something shifted. And Kelly, who had spent her entire adult life inside an industry that asked her to perform vulnerability while keeping the real kind carefully locked away, allowed herself something she genuinely struggled to permit. She let herself hope that this was the one who would stay. That this was the proof she had been waiting for since she was 6 years old, standing in a house that suddenly had one fewer person in it. By December 2012, he had proposed. By October 2013, they were married in a ceremony in Tennessee that looked, from every possible angle, like the beginning of something beautiful. River Rose arrived in 2014. Remington Alexander in 2016. The house that Kelly's childhood had fractured appeared, at last, to be reassembled. But there is something nobody talks about enough when it comes to the marriages of people who grew up inside early abandonment. There is a particular pattern that emerges. Not inevitably, but often enough that therapists who work in this area have a name for it. When you are shaped by a love that left, you become extraordinarily skilled at tolerating things you should not have to tolerate, at explaining away the distance, at filling in the gaps yourself so that the overall structure still looks intact from a distance. You become, in the language of people who have studied this, very good at not seeing what you cannot afford to see. Kelly Clarkson was, for years, very good at not seeing. She described the marriage, in the period before everything collapsed, as one where she had learned to operate as if she were already alone, making decisions without genuine partnership, carrying the emotional weight of their shared life in ways that were not equal and were not right, but that she had normalized so completely she could no longer feel the abnormality of it. Friends who were close to her during those years would later describe a woman who had become an expert at performing wholeness, who could stand on a stage or in front of a camera and project a life that looked full, when the truth was something considerably quieter and considerably lonelier. What she has only very recently begun to say out loud, and what cuts closest to the truth that was buried deepest, is that the Brandon Blackstock she had married and the Brandon Blackstock who actually existed in their marriage were not entirely the same person. That the version of him she had needed him to be, had believed him to be, had organized significant parts of her emotional life around him being, that version was constructed, partly by him, and partly, Kelly has acknowledged with the kind of honesty that takes years to earn, by herself. Because when you need someone to be your proof that love stays, you will see what you need to see. You will explain what needs explaining. You will hold the structure together with your own hands and call it partnership and not examine too closely the question of whose hands are actually doing the work. There were financial realities inside that marriage that Kelly only fully understood after it ended. Professional decisions made in her name, or claimed to have been made in her name, that upon examination served purposes other than her own. There were arrangements and structures and agreements that wore the clothing of support and wore the face of care, and that Kelly, inside a marriage, inside the noise and motion of building a life together, had trusted without the verification that, in hindsight, she understood she should have demanded. She trusted him. That is the part that matters most. She trusted him with the things she was least able to protect herself in relation to: her finances, her professional trajectory, the architecture of a life she had built from nothing. And that trust, it emerged over time, had been extended to someone who was not entirely who she had believed him to be. The divorce filing came in June 2020. And then what followed was not the clean, if painful, separation that the public narrative suggested. It was prolonged. It was costly. It was, by every account of those who watched it unfold, significantly more brutal in its details than anything that appeared in the press. The Montana ranch that Brandon refused to leave became a legal battleground for years. The custody arrangements were fought over with an intensity that told its own story about the nature of what had broken between them. The courts ultimately sided with Kelly, primary custody of their children. Brandon ordered to vacate the property. The legal system gave her back what was hers. But legal resolution and emotional resolution are not the same thing. They rarely are. Kelly moved to New York City, restarted the Kelly Clarkson Show in a new studio with new energy and a new chapter announced in every detail. She was funny on camera. She was warm. She interviewed guests with the kind of genuine engagement that can't be faked, and she was, by every visible measure, doing exactly what she always did when life handed her something unsurvivable. She survived it. In public. With grace. But in June 2023, she released Chemistry. And Chemistry was not a performance of survival. It was the sound of someone finally setting down what they had been carrying. Critics understood immediately that something different was happening here. The album didn't use the soft vocabulary of heartbreak that pop music often reaches for, the universal, the relatable, the carefully nonspecific. These songs had edges. They had the particular, specific anger and grief and disbelief of someone recounting events that actually happened to them, in detail, in a sequence they could not forget because they had lived it. Lines that didn't sound like artistic license. Lines that sounded like documentation. People who listened to Chemistry and knew Kelly's story understood that she was telling them something she had not told them before. Not everything. Not with names attached. But enough. Enough that if you were paying attention, you could hear the shape of what she had protected for years beginning to come through the music in the way that truths always eventually come through, sideways in art, before they can be spoken directly. And then she began to speak directly. Not with a press release. Not with a lawyer-approved statement. But in interviews, in moments where the discipline she had maintained for years relaxed slightly, where the careful management of her own narrative gave way to something more honest and considerably more raw. She began to confirm what the music had suggested. That what existed inside that marriage was not what it had appeared to be from the outside. That the person she had built her most fundamental hope around had not, in the ways that mattered most, been the person she had believed she was building that hope around. That her father had left. And Brandon, in the ways that define what leaving actually means, had never quite arrived. That is the thing about this story that almost no one understood while it was happening. The public narrative of Kelly and Brandon was always framed around the divorce, around the ending, around the legal battles and the property disputes and the custody arrangements. Those were the visible facts, the things that could be documented and reported and discussed. What was invisible was the much longer, much quieter story of a woman inside a marriage, realizing slowly and then all at once that the emotional contract she believed she had signed was not the contract that had actually been in place. She has spoken about the period after the filing, the period when the noise of their life together finally went quiet, as one of the most profoundly disorienting of her life. Not because she missed him, but because in the silence she could finally hear herself think. And what she heard, when she stopped performing normalcy long enough to actually listen, was the sound of understanding arriving. The specific, irreversible understanding of a person who has been living one story while quietly inhabiting another, and who finally has enough distance to see both stories clearly at the same time. The sorting of that takes time. It is not clean. It involves sitting with questions that don't have satisfying answers. How much did I know? How long did I know it? What did I choose not to see and why? And finding a way to hold those questions without letting them become the whole of who you are. Kelly did that work. She has said so explicitly. Therapy. Time. The discipline of rebuilding in the daylight instead of maintaining something broken in the dark. She made the album. She moved to New York. She chose, every single morning, to let her children see a mother who kept going not because the circumstances demanded it, but because she had decided, somewhere in the wreckage, that she was allowed to be okay. That surviving wasn't the ceiling. That something better than surviving was still available to her. What she carried inside that marriage, the truth she protected, even as the courts were ruling in her favor and the public was moving on to the next story, was the knowledge that she had loved a version of a man that had never fully existed, that she had needed that version so desperately, had built so much of her fundamental sense of safety and worth around it, that she had extended her trust far past the point where the evidence supported it. Not because she was naive. Because she was human. Because the 6-year-old in Burleson who watched her father leave without looking back needed, more than anything else, to believe that someone was finally capable of staying. She has never spoken about Brandon Blackstock with malice. That restraint is not an accident. It is a choice she makes consciously, every time, because her children will grow up and read everything ever written about their father. And she has decided that she will not be the one who defines him for them. That particular grace costs something real. It costs something she pays quietly, without acknowledgement, in the space between what she knows and what she says. But she is saying more now than she once said. In the way that people do when they have finally put enough distance between themselves and the fire that they can describe the temperature of it without being burned again. Kelly Clarkson stood on a stage in 2002 and changed her life with the only tool she had ever fully trusted. Her voice. She has been using it ever since to navigate a world that handed her an enormous amount of everything except the one thing she started out needing most, the certainty that the people she loved would still be there when she turned around. Brandon Blackstock was not that certainty. The marriage was not the proof she was looking for. And the years she spent inside it, believing and then doubting and then finally, clearly, seeing, those years belonged to her now in a way they did not while she was still living them. Nobody knew what was happening behind those photographs of them smiling on red carpets. Nobody knew what she was explaining to herself in the quiet of that Montana ranch. Nobody knew the full weight of what she carried through every episode of her talk show, every concert, every carefully managed public appearance in the years when the legal battle was grinding forward and the truth was still locked behind a door she wasn't ready to open. She is opening it now. On her own terms. In her own time. And the story that is coming out, slowly, carefully, in music and in interviews and in the quiet accumulation of what she has finally allowed herself to confirm, is not the story anyone thought they were watching from the outside. It never is. That is the thing about the truths people carry for years before they set them down. They are always heavier than they look.